Let's get back to our guests. Shane Oliver, Head of Investment Strategy and Chief Economist at AMP Capital Investors in Sydney. And staying with us is our guest host, Marc Faber, Editor and Publisher of the Gloom, Boom and Doom Report, joining us live from Hong Kong. Shane, let me start with you again on something that Marc said a moment ago. And he said that the bailout is bound to be a failure sooner or later. Well, there is an alternative plan, I believe, that is being thrashed around at the moment. Probably numerous alternative plans. One of them, coming from the House of Reps, is that, House Republicans rather, involves the government insuring mortgages instead of essentially wholesale buying them from the market. What do you think, Shane?
I mean, it's a bit hard to assess all of these plans that keep floating around. I think the trouble with that one, though, is that the actual suggestion is that the private sector undertakes the insurance. So the private sector mortgage holders insure their mortgages, or there's some sort of premium attached to them, and that creates the fund. I think it's probably too late to set up that sort of thing, and I don't think that the private sector would be able to do it on its own at the moment. It would just actually exact more pain rather than solve the problem. I think the best solution is something like the 1989 Resolution Trust Corporation, which basically took the bad debt out of the system and then put it on the side, and then over the years gradually sold it off. I think that's probably the preferable approach, and something like that is what is being talked about by Paulson, Bernanke and so on. That's probably the best approach. I mean, at the end of the day, this won't solve all of America's problems. It's going to remove a lot of the financial risk and the risk of a financial meltdown, but we're still going to go through an economic recession in the US, and the indicators out of the US, of course, overnight were quite terrible. So it's not going to do anything about the short-term economic outlook, but it just helps remove that risk of a financial meltdown and therefore the risk of a much deeper and prolonged recession in the US.
Yeah, I mean, if we try to assess what kind of performance Bernanke and Paulson, the dynamic duo, are doing at the moment. Marc, what would you say, maybe a score out of 10 for Bernanke and Paulson and trying to shovel Wall Street out of this mess? What would you say?
Well, 10 being the best or the worst?
Being the best.
-10.
Why is that?
I think if you want to restore confidence in the system, Mr. Bernanke and Mr. Paulson should resign right away, and Mr. Volcker should be appointed as a temporary Fed chairman, because he would enjoy the confidence of investors and of market participants, and Mr. Bernanke has zero credibility among any economist.
Why?
Well, first of all, he doesn't understand economics properly. He looks at the depression of 1929 to 32. I'd like to emphasize that the conditions that led to the depression are very different than they are today. Secondly, I tried to explain that the problem of the US is excess leverage. In other words, say the brokerage industry in the early 1990s had a leverage of about 10 to 1. And now, as you know, it's sometimes 30 to 1. And that happened under the eyes of the Treasury Department, the SEC, the Federal Reserve. In fact, the Federal Reserve has encouraged leveraging up by keeping interest rates artificially low. And I bet you, if the Fed hadn't cut interest rates from 5.25% to 2% last year, from September 18th onwards, the financial crisis today would be less, because as interest rates collapsed, the brokerage firms leveraged up even more.
Unfortunately, we have to end this discussion right here. We've run out of time, but always good to talk to both of you. We'll get back to you, Marc and Shane. Thanks for your time. Shane Oliver, Head of Investment Strategy and Chief Economist at AMP Capital Investors.